Over the last couple of weeks, hundreds of thousands of people all around the world have protested about racism. The slogan that's been shouted at these protests is that Black Lives Matter. And the reason that thousands of people have shouted this is because it seems that black lives really don't matter as much as white lives. Some people have responded to this by saying that all lives matter. And of course they do. Nobody is actually denying that. But take a look at this image that's been going around the internet. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," someone in the crowd corrects him and says, "All people are blessed." We might smile, but the sort of people who don't like hearing Black Lives Matter would have been just as annoyed when Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor." Back when Jesus said those words, poor people were treated unfairly and unjustly every day. Last month, George Floyd's death in Minneapolis was simply the latest example of African Americans being treated unfairly by the police. Here in Australia, there are thousands of occasions when Aboriginal Australians have been treated unfairly by our justice system, sometimes with fatal results.
For example, for every 330 Australian white men, one of them is in jail. For Aboriginal men, it's 1 in 21. For every 21 Aboriginal men, one of them is in jail. Aboriginal Australians are not the most evil race on earth. There is something very wrong with our justice system.
The reason I'm talking about this is because Jesus talks about it. I don't mean Jesus talked about Black Lives Matter. When Jesus was on earth, there were no white people in Australia or America. In fact, there were no people at all in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But Jesus spent a lot of his time talking about the kingdom of God. Now these days, kings and queens are mostly figureheads. The vast majority of us live in countries ruled by democratic governments. And governments vary. Some are competent, others aren't. And some are truthful and just, and again, others aren't. But back in Jesus' time, kings and queens had real power. And so Jesus talked about the kingdom of God. In fact, he said that the good news was about the kingdom of God. And Jesus sent his 12 disciples out to spread this good news. Here's how Matthew's Gospel describes what happened. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. Now, the kingdom of God isn't just a new government. It's something we need to respond to as individuals as well. We need to acknowledge the authority of God in our own lives. The reason this kingdom is good news is because of who the king is. When the disciples say that the kingdom of God has come near, what they mean is that God's authority has come near in the person of Jesus. In other words, the king of God's kingdom is Jesus. So that's what Jesus tells the disciples to say. But what are they supposed to do? Well, Jesus tells them, cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. In other words, Jesus is telling those 12 disciples and us to do exactly what Jesus himself had been doing, to cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. Now, most of us don't have the miraculous powers that Jesus had. It takes us quite a bit longer when we cure the sick and cleanse the lepers. And I'm not aware of anyone who's got the power to raise people from the dead. But we can metaphorically raise people from the dead. George Floyd was buried a few days ago. He isn't coming back. But we can lift up George Floyd's name and say that this is where God's kingdom will be different. And as we do that, we're saying that we want our society and our government to be more like God's kingdom. And we can also lift up George Floyd's name and say, this is where God's King, Jesus, is changing my heart. This is where Jesus is making me ready for God's kingdom by changing the way I think about people who are different to me. See, Jesus was serious when he said, "Blessed are the poor," or "Blessed are those who mourn." Not because he's got nothing to offer those of us who are rich or who aren't mourning, but because God's kingdom is for people who need it, for people who are prepared to follow Jesus, for those who want God's justice, for people who can let go of everything and trust Jesus. I've put my trust in Jesus, and I'd encourage you to trust Jesus as well.